Greetings. Both in real life and in the context of the internet, although primarily in the context of the internet, I've been asked what my thoughts are on the United States and Europe, or the United States versus Europe. I happen to be fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you perceive it, as possessing dual citizenship, one of the United States, the other of Hungary. While I've never spent a significant amount of time in Hungary, I have spent most of my adult life, however, in places such as Germany, Austria, UK, France, etc. And I've also spent time in the United States. I grew up in the United States. I grew up in New York City, which is, of course, I should note, atypical for the United States. It's a fairly unique city in the context of that country, but nonetheless, it is technically part of the United States. And I do catch a little bit of, or have caught a little bit of what goes on in the United States, having grown up there. I tend to encounter a great deal of misunderstanding on the part of Americans towards Europeans and vice versa. The cultural system, for lack of a better description, tends to be very different in the United States and vice versa. The European system, the economic institutions, etc., tend to be quite different from the American ones, and the American ones tend to be quite different from the European ones. And both sides tend to pigeonhole and try to explain things along the lines of, why life is better here, as in Europe, or why life is better here, as in the United States. When you lack a perspective on both things, it's very easy to be one-sided or take a one-sided position on this. But the reality is that as to the question, what's better, where do you have a better quality of life, it all depends. It depends on many things. And a lot of it depends on the environment you grow up in. Contrary to what people believe, I think the environment has a very strong impact on people. That doesn't mean that we have this magical free will. It just means that we are subject to the environment beyond our control. And before I proceed on speaking on the subject, I'd like to make reference to a publication. I will be posting a link to the short article as well as the much longer publication that I'm not going to read from because it's pretty technical. You should check it out, however, concerning the differences, the core differences in the American mentality versus the European mentality. So this is just essentially an excerpt from Live Science. Americans really do love to work, it seems, while Europeans are much happier if they skip burning the midnight oil in favor of leisure. That's according to a new study finding longer work hours make Europeans unhappy, while Americans get a very slight, albeit not statistically significant, bliss boost from the extra grind. Quote, those who work longer hours in Europe are less happy than those who work shorter hours, but in the U.S., it's the other way around, end quote, said study author Adam Okulits-Kozar, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, a clinical assistant professor of public policy at the University of Texas at Dallas. The working hours category does not have a very big impact on the probability of happiness of Americans. The study, based on survey data, can't tease out whether work causes happiness or unhappiness, though the researchers speculate the effect has to do with the expectations and how a person measures success. Okulits-Kozarin used surveys of European and American attitudes for the study. The surveys included questions about the number of hours worked, and asked respondents to identify if they were very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy. They found that in the likelihood of Europeans describing themselves as very happy dropped from around 28% to 23% as work hours climbed from under 17 hours a week to more than 60 hours per week. Americans, on the other hand, held steady with about a 43% chance of describing themselves as happy regardless of working hours. The results held even after researchers accounted for possible confounding factors such as age, marital status, and household income. Because of a lack of research in the area, Okulits-Kozarin said it's not clear longer hours are the cause of happiness or unhappiness here. It's quite difficult to argue causality, he said. Without hard data, there are a number of potential explanations for why happiness may differ when it comes to work hours. It depends on what one's feeling is about the aspirations of Europeans and Americans, said Richard Easterlin, a professor of economics at the University of Southern California, who was not involved in the study. We don't have a lot of good evidence on that. He added, I feel Europeans are more inclined to enjoy life and enjoy leisure, and Americans are more likely to be pursuing income and increasing their income. There's a difference in the structure of aspirations. However, I'm not sure I could give you concrete evidence to that effect. Americans may be onto something. Past research has shown that wealth can bring happiness, particularly if a person's income is greater than their peers. Another study suggested that as income increases, so does a person's overall satisfaction with life. However, that money lift didn't mean more moment-to-moment enjoyment of those days, which instead depended much more on social and physical factors, such as whether a person smoked or spent the day alone. Easterlin and Okulitz-Kozarin agree that perceptions may also play a big role, as people believe their hard work has a greater impact on their success or upward mobility, may be happier working more. In some countries in Europe, the income mobility may be higher, for instance, in Germany, says Easterlin. It's not really that hard work brings more success in the U.S. than in Europe, it's what people believe in. Oculus-Kozorin says happiness working longer hours may be a product of the American dream, not of its reality, but belief in the dream itself. The idea that hard work brings success and the whole idea of the American dream is really artificial and made up by public policymakers and politicians to attract immigrants, he said, explaining that studies on the topic indicate that Europeans have similar levels of social mobility and a similar correlation between hard work and success. Now, I could continue reading, it's almost done, but I just wanted to give you a gist. The much more extensive publication, larger publication, is also in the low bar, and you could read it, rather should read it. But one theory that they've come up with, which seems to have some evidence to support it, is that the difference in perception of work is due to, well, essentially tax rates, marginal tax rates. That is, in the United States, you tend to keep more of what you earn, and so you're more motivated to work more. Whereas in Europe, generally the more you earn, the less you keep, and so there's not much motivation there. But this is really interesting, and a lot of this obviously needs to, as they explained in this short article, this needs to be further explored and further studied. But it does explain some, or at least hint at some explanations of some core differences between Europeans in general and Americans. One, of course, is the system, how the system works. Europeans in general tend to be much more heavily taxed than Americans, but they also receive much more social benefits. Europeans tend to be overall much more satisfied with their health care, for example, quote-unquote socialized medicine, than are Americans. Americans tend to be happier working longer hours. And I've noticed a lot of misunderstanding, I think, arising even in the MGTOW community with respect to this. By and large, most people in the MGTOW community are Anglophones. It's my impression, and specifically America, the United States, as well as Canada, represents a rather large portion of the quote-unquote MGTOW community. And a lot of these ideas of, I would say, success ideation, that is, working tons of hours in order to make lots of money, are things that I've received in private messages. A lot of my European subscribers don't really understand. And although I understand it, it's not something I can relate to as a sort of half of both and not really belonging to anything. But if it's true, what the study intimates, well, it could shed some light on this. This is also part of the quote-unquote American dream, which originally had its origins in the puritanical origins of the United States. The United States was in some sense founded by the Pilgrims, right, who had a specific form of Protestantism and an attitude towards the world and what have you. And almost certainly, whether it's true or not, and that's a separate issue, and I don't think it's true, there is the idea in the United States that hard work can get you anywhere and can get you anything. And certainly with lower tax rates, you will keep more money than you otherwise would, say, in Europe by working longer hours. But what I find fascinating here is the distinct cultural difference. And in this respect, I'm wholly on the European side, the leisure side. I vastly prefer having more leisure time and time to do what I want than just simply making more money and increasing my income if I have to make the choice. And having done various things in my life, I worked a job once in Asia where I was working 7 days a week, and from my standards, making lots of money. I was pretty fucking miserable overall. I had very little free time, my health was poor, etc. Could it have been better in a different context? Perhaps, but I certainly don't ever want to work 7 days a week again. But it goes a long way in explaining what the key differences are between Americans and Europeans, why Americans don't really understand Europeans, and generally speaking, why Europeans don't really understand Americans. Europeans look at the United States with its kind of unstable health care system, the long working hours, the doing a million jobs, and they just scratch their heads and say, why would anyone want to do that? Now, I sort of share that view, but I understand as a pseudo-American, if you will, someone who grew up in the United States, that, yeah, that's just the way it is there. Americans, on the other hand, look at Europeans and think, oh, these fucking lazy pricks that don't want to work and blah, 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 and everything's socialized. And the problem here is that both worldviews, as usual, are coming from an absolutist stance. You'll see posts, for example, by the Huffington Post praising the leisure and the life of in Europe and how much better it is in the United States. Now, for me, life in Europe is better than the United States, but I'm not an absolutist thinker. I don't want to commit myself ever completely to any sort of ideology or belief system, because new evidence arises and we don't know everything, and I never will know everything. So the idea that, say, yeah, I have a better life in Europe, and I was recently conversing with another American expatriate who happens to be in Germany as well, who says his life is much better in Germany or in Europe too. That doesn't mean that I think that's universally the case, or that should be the case for all Americans. The problem here is the environment, right? Most Americans growing up in a system where the taxes tend to be much lower are, yeah, as is intimated in the article in the publication, much more likely to appreciate working more because you tend to gain more. I mean, despite being, in terms of mental and emotional happiness, in the absolute dregs when I was working 7 days a week, I was paying, 3.3% tax? I wasn't paying very much in the way of taxes. I was keeping almost everything. I was able to pay for a massive amount of education without borrowing anything, etc. It was nice, but I wouldn't want to do that again. But I understand, on the other hand, where Americans are coming from. The idea of hard work paying off and what have you, despite it at least being partially fallacious. That is, just because you work hard doesn't necessarily mean at all that you're going to be successful. Luck is everything. Life is a lottery. That mentality is so firmly rooted in the United States that it's very difficult for people to relate to that if they're outside of that country. I mean, if you've grown up in Europe your entire life, that's going to be a bit foreign. Europeans have a different perspective on things. They are much more inclined to look at, well, life is a lottery, and not everyone's going to be able to do everything, that kind of mindset. But it does seem, though, that it's not really a question of Europeans are happier or more satisfied than Americans, and that's the end of the argument or the end of the discussion. It's a question of Americans are satisfied and content for, well, their own reasons, because of the tax system, because of the cultural institutions and the history. They tend to enjoy working a lot more. There are more benefits to working more. You keep more money, and Americans tend to correlate financial success and possession of things with greater amounts of happiness than Europeans do, who value social relationships and just leisure time a lot more than Americans do. It's impossible to say, one side is more content or happier than the other. And so it's really just a question of very different perspectives on the world, and perspectives that are in large measure incompatible. Now, of course, there are always going to be subsectors in the populace that are going to think, well, if only we had it this way, then X would follow. I mean, people who are extremely liberally inclined, say in the United States, look to European institutions as a sort of role model of how things should be in the United States. And without a doubt, some Americans would be happier in that system than they would be in the American system. Likewise, there are people in Europe who think taxation is too high. I actually do think taxation overall is too high. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I'm not extreme though in this regard, who think, yeah, they're sort of classical liberals or whatever, and Europe's gone down the drain and needs to adopt a much more American model and what have you. And of course, those kinds of people probably would be more content in the United States than they would be in Germany. So there are always going to be subsectors of the population that view things differently. And indeed, it's also a question of mentality. And I'm going to introduce the topic of neuropolitics here, so bear with me. Now, recently, in the realm of what's come to be called neuropolitics, or the study of the science of the neurology behind political ideologies and leanings, there have been a number of studies done that explore essentially the brain composition of quote-unquote liberals and conservatives, and they have actually discovered some significant differences. Do these differences explain everything? Certainly not. And there needs to be a lot more work done in this area of neuropolitics. But briefly, I'll read off to you what the discoveries have been. These discoveries have been primarily made in the last 3 or 4 years. But here we go. Recent work has shown a correlation between liberalism and the conflict-related activity measured by event-related potentials originating in the anterior cingulate cortex. Here we show that dysfunctional correlate of political attitudes has a counterpart in brain structure. In a large sample of young adults, we related self-reported political attitudes to gray matter volume using structural MRI. We found that greater liberalism was associated with increased gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, whereas greater conservatism was associated with increased volume of the right amygdala. These results were replicated in an independent sample of additional participants. Our findings extend previous observations that political attitudes reflect differences in self-regulatory conflict monitoring and recognition of emotional phases by showing that such attitudes are reflected in human brain structure. Although our data do not determine whether these regions play a causal role in the formation of political attitudes, they converge with previous work to suggest a possible link between brain structure and psychological mechanisms that mediate political attitudes. Now, this is a pretty long article. I will be posting a link, so please feel free, and I would encourage you to read it in its entirety. But I just wanted to give a gist of what's going on. Basically, to simplify it, the amygdala tends to regulate the sort of fear reactions towards things, and the anterior cingulate cortex is something that is much more involved in reasoning and teasing out conflict in human beings. Now, this has implications, no absolutist implications. We need to avoid those kinds of implications. But in conservatism, for example, or traditionalism, the desire to preserve a former structure, or a structure perceived as being stable, the desire to fend off opposing views, this would correspond with the MRI discoveries made in these recent studies. I mean, if you look at any prominent conservative, say on YouTube, a guy like Chapin, I mean, there is no room for new data to enter into the guy's head. And if to the extent that there is room, it just ends up being filtered through this sort of ideological funnel of traditional or conservatism or whatever. That in addition to that, we know that conservatives tend to be more religious, and religion helps to mitigate fear and at least assuage some of the pains that that accompany one in life through change, etc. So these correlations probably at least have some impact on why people tend to go down a conservative route. And then conversely, when we talk about the anterior cingulate cortex, sometimes referred to as the ACC, liberals, tendency-wise, not an absolute sense, tend to be much more inclined to have greater activity in that area of the brain, right? I mean, this, dealing with internal conflict, teasing out conflict, thinking out complex situations, liberals are much more inclined to insist on change rather than sticking with the old guard. So these aren't absolutist implications at all. A lot more work needs to be done, but they do show you certain things, and they do prove certain things, that politics, one's political leanings oftentimes are a lot less about, well, what's factually true than how one's brain is essentially shaped and what one is most naturally inclined to. And so you just end up getting two sides arguing their point, but their points are kind of irrelevant in a factual context because essentially their neurology is dictating what they find most appealing. Now, returning to the European American divide, I suspect something similar is going on. I think obviously at the neurological level there are going to be differences, obviously, because people are different. Every difference in a human being will be accounted for by some sort of neurological difference. But I would be curious to see if the kinds of studies they've done on, say, conservatism and liberalism in human beings, they weren't massive sample sizes, but there were enough. If these could be performed on a much larger scale, say between Europeans and Americans, to get an idea of something similar. I don't know if it would be identical to this. Maybe it would be differences found elsewhere in the brain. I don't know. But it just shows that the idea of one side being correct while the other is incorrect it's kind of untenable. It's untenable because people are coming from different circumstances, that is the environment, and they're coming from different physiologies, genetics, biology, that is neurology. And this combination of neurology and biology is going to lead to a different perception of the world and a different appreciation of things. Now, where do I fall into this? That would be way too long a video to make, but suffice to say, I do prefer living in Europe. I don't agree with everything that goes on here, but I do prefer living here overall, and I find myself much less comfortable with the American model of just working yourself till you drop. And I've seen this is really interesting in the MGTOW context, how this has manifested itself. There is a perception, at least in some parts of some, that men, even after going your own way, who don't strive for material success are somehow losers, or they're not essentially real men. This term is never used, real men, though it is heavily implied. I've talked about this before. And this attitude almost invariably comes from the Anglosphere, specifically the Anglo-American sphere of things. And it shows a marked misunderstanding of a lot of the attitudes that, say, European people have, and specifically European men. That's, of course, not universally true in Europe. I'm not saying that. But generally speaking, the trend is to value leisure more than simply working a lot. And I understand the American attitude, even though I don't necessarily share it. But it's interesting how there is, I've observed time and again, this cultural divide essentially in men going their own way. Sure, we can, for the most part, agree on certain aspects of human behavior, and absolutely, in a universal sense, there are basically human behavioral universals, female and male, that hold true no matter what the country is, no matter what the nation is. But when you move beyond that and look at specific environmental factors, be it tax rates or institutions or whatever, or just plain history, that's when it becomes interesting. And I actually see a division. It's not a hostile division per se, but a division between, I think, Anglo-Saxon, specifically Anglo-American, men go in their own way, and those of a more European mindset. And there is a tendency in the Anglo-Saxon sphere to kind of look down upon the European mindset and the European approach to things, and it extends then into the MGTOW area of things, where people who don't seek vast amount of material wealth and simply don't work for the sake of working, and don't think that money is the pinnacle of success. This is sort of frowned upon and looked down upon. And I almost certainly see this as having its origins in the United States. I understand their mentality, but I don't share it. And likewise, like I said, I don't think Europe is for every American and the European attitude. But It is interesting how there is certainly a cultural presence. I like to refer to it more as an environmental presence that helps shape how we perceive the world and what is most beneficial to us. And there is, of course, a great deal of neuronal flexibility. You know, had an American grown up in Europe, no doubt his attitudes would be different. But we are the products of our biology and our environment solely. So I just thought I'd make this video to clarify some things, to explain some things, and to show that taking an absolutist perspective on most of these issues seems to be just completely wrong. There's just no way you can say this is better for human beings and that's not as good, or vice versa, simply because depending on your own genetics and the environment you grow up in, some things are going to be better than others. For me, I find myself more prosperous in Europe. For someone else, that would be the United States. So I generally ignore claims that, say, the Huffington Post makes about, well, see, if the United States just had a European model, everything would be hunky-dory and perfect. And I also ignore libertarian stuff and conservative stuff saying, well, if tax rates were much lower, blah, 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 blah. Nothing's perfect and both things work. But my hope in making this video is to foster a little bit more understanding and less hostility, sort of I'm right, you're wrong attitude when it comes to these issues, because it's a lot more complicated than that, as we've seen in these studies on the differences in neurological composition between liberals and conservatives, and the environmental issues that almost certainly affect one's attitudes towards work and life. So anyway, I'll end the video here. Thanks for watching, and I will check you out later. Bye-bye.